So, many of you know that I taught English in Japan. I went over there to be a missionary English teacher. What that ended up looking like was I was hired by a church to teach English lessons. The big draw for me was that they would be affordably priced English lessons for which was a sought-after service. Still is a sought-after service in Japan. It was a really tough time for me. I think I've mentioned before that my team and we were heavily exploited. We worked really long hours, we traveled all over the Osaka area, and we lived in squalor while living in one of the most expensive areas in the world. It took months for me to be able to save up enough money to come back home eventually. But the day before I flew out, I got to have one last teaching session with my students, my adult students. And we're having lunch, and completely unprovoked because I try not to speak ill of my employers, right? Like, I came over here for a cause I believed in at the time. One of my students says, "We know that you would have to leave eventually. This is a really hard job. Religion's just a business. The temples only care about making money, and the shrines only care about money, and the churches only care about money." And that broke my heart. That crushed me. Now, I can't speak for shrines and for temples. I have friends who've been a part of those traditions, Shintoism and Pure Land Buddhism, and I'm sure there are some who are in it for the money, but I'm also sure there's many who aren't. I can't speak for churches. There are a lot of churches that do treat this like a business, who care about filling pews and offering trays. But what is church supposed to be about? Well, in the book of Acts, we get an idea, at least according to our author, the guy who wrote Luke and Acts, of what the church ought to resemble. We get this picture of what a lot of us call like the prototypical church. And it's kind of the container that we come back to again and again and again. When people are making a new church, or they're trying to like reevaluate the work of a church or whatever, they often come back to this idea of what a church could and should be. Now, to set the stage a little bit, this text that was just read, it takes place on the day of Pentecost. Peter has gone out, he's preached a very compelling message to the crowds, one of forgiveness. You see in the pages of Luke and in Acts, we kind of get this different idea of the work that God is busy with people than in some of the other Gospels and the letters of Paul. Jesus didn't come to pay the debt that we all owe to God for the sins we make. That's an image in some of the other Gospels and in some of the letters of Paul that we get. But in Luke and in Acts, the idea is more that God just wants to forgive people. If we have debts, God just wants to clear them. God doesn't need to be paid off for it. God just wants to be reconciled, that's all. I love that image. And I can see why it's compelling. Sometimes we just need to know God doesn't hold animosity towards us, right? At least I need to know that. I make mistakes, I make bad choices. I still find it compelling. The needs to know. Yes, I've made bad choices, but God does not see me as a bad person. I'm beloved to God. We're beloved. And so you have at least according to our author, who knows how it really went down, on that very first day of Pentecost, 3,000 people in Jerusalem who are like, oh, wow, I want in on that. And they all convert, and they start gathering together, and the church is born. And when they gather, we get to see that the things that they formed as their container for their religious life was dedication to the apostles' teachings. Hey, we still teach each other today, right? That's part of it. They gather together for the sake of fellowship. I'll get into that a little bit more in a moment. They break bread together. What else? Oh, they pray. I'm like, what was the last one? They pray too. All of this is modeled after the synagogue system. So this isn't something that the writers just came up with. This isn't something that the early, the apostles are just like, I know what we should do. We should have all of these things. We should make this the parameters of our meeting. No, it comes from the synagogue system. Now, I know some of us have participated in worship in a Jewish community, and you may be able to see that some of the similarities. Well, we have some shared DNA. We come from a similar source. And those similarities are intentional on the part of the early church leaders. They thought that's a pretty good idea. So when it comes to the apostles' teachings, they would come together and they would talk about their understanding of their Bible, the Hebrew scriptures, at least the ones they can get their hands on. We have to remember, this isn't a highly literate society, and it's very expensive to make, published works on paper. So you would take what you could find, and you would, that would be a very dear thing, especially for those who could read it. So there's the text, but there's also the teachings around the text. And for the early church, a lot of this would have looked like, well, this is how we make sense of this passage, but also this is how we make sense of Jesus. And this is a highly oral society. We shouldn't be too surprised that within several generations, we have a highly diverse Christianity. In a lot of ways, it's more diverse than we conceive of Christianity today, in some pretty wild ways that sometimes we're able to get into when I truly get to nerd out in our Connect groups. To be honest, I sometimes over-nerd. So I try not to speak until it's my turn to speak. I try. It doesn't always go that way. So they would also dedicate themselves to prayer. And I want to talk real quick about what prayer meant to them. It did not just mean telling God what you want to have happen and hoping or expecting that God would do it. That did happen sometimes in the book of Acts. But it is more about seeking to align with what God wants. So this isn't so much a genie in the bottle approach to God. It's more of a, well, God, how do I align with your will, your desire? If you want a better world, and I'm praying for a better world, I want to align with you on living into a better world. And then we've got the breaking of bread. Now, this isn't just communion, although, that certainly is part of it. I was initially ordained with the Christian Church, Disciples of Christ, and for those of you who don't know, communion happens every single week, and it's one of those sacraments that people gush over. Like, oh, we get to do communion every single week. And if it doesn't happen on a week, they miss it. I get that. But I was also a part of the Quakers for a bit, and they would say, well, all of life is communion with God. You don't need bread and juice. That's every day. Like, that's also a really beautiful idea. But I did kind of miss the physicality of the symbols. I missed being able to partake in these instruments, because on a sensory level, doing this for years, it starts resonating, it starts singing within you in a sort of way. It feels like sharing company with God and one another. I think when you take part in these rituals for long enough, it doesn't feel like you're just having communion, you and God. You can remember the people who've been on life's journey with you, the folks that you've shared space with, sometimes close by, sometimes on the other side of the world, right? But to the early church, it wasn't just about communion. Breaking bread was breaking bread. It was a potluck. You see, the way they would do communion, many of them, was to have an agape feast, a love feast. So you would have this meal together, and you would remember that God is with you in the potluck, in the casserole, in the potato salad, in the punch, all of it. And that leads us to the next part, fellowship, because I do see these as deeply entwined. It's part of why I make a stink about having potlucks. It's part of why I love monthly potlucks with the Connect group, and whenever we get the chance to just share food with each other, it helps bring down walls, So we've got our hall over here, Eastminster Hall. We also refer to that as the Fellowship Hall. But for those of us who didn't grow up with such language, what on earth does a fellowship mean? Is it a bunch of dudes on a ship, as my grandpa would say? It's about building connection, relationship with one another. It's about building community. Really, at the core of fellowship is this building of friendship together. Sometimes we just like old-timey words for things, though. It sounds more religious. That's why some people, this is, that right there, that's not the entryway. That's the foyer, the narthex. Some of you knew. I forgot for a moment. Like, what is that? What is that? Part of growing up evangelical conservative, yeah, we don't have names for that, This is not the chancel to conservative evangelicals who don't have the same language. It's the stage. I'll tell you, I've made the mistake of calling this a stage in mixed company. It's a chancel. But for most of us in this room, right? So fellowship is about building, fostering relationships of mutual care and concern. It's about laughing with each other. It's about crying with each other. It's about showing up at each other's house when you're sick, after you've called to make sure it's okay, for that meal train, Now, churches come back to these four elements over and over again. And then in our text, we get this page break, not kind of a section break. Our editors have in here, the subtitle above it. And it makes it look like this next text is separated from the text that comes before it. And it talks about the church in harmony. And I wonder if that separation of these two different sections reflects a reality for so many of us. That while most churches have devotion to apostles' teachings and prayer and, breaking of bread in some form and fellowship, we don't always experience churches being in harmony. I wonder if part of that is because we don't really take this section seriously. Not as seriously as this other stuff. Well, what's a church service if you don't have these other things, right? But I also wonder if it's because what the church does for this harmony is just a bit too intense. I'm going to share it with you. So the church sought to live into the world that God wants now, in anticipation that God would indeed manifest that world eventually. And so we see this norm arise. And it's not just in Acts chapter 2. We see it appear in different forms that churches take throughout this book, where the believers share all things in common. They make sure nobody goes without need. Some of them sell their homes and pool their resources to make sure that those who don't have the luxury of a home are taken care of, have food, have something to drink. That's intense. That's severe. That sounds a little bit too socialistic for a lot of us, right? Not everybody is selling their homes. But we do have a lot of folks who have the space, who choose to share the space with their communities, which makes a lot of sense. They don't have church buildings, so homes become church buildings. But they make sure that they share all things in common so that none go without need, so that the reality of the world made right is taking place for them. In their little slice of the world, people don't go without because they're taking care of each other. I love that. And I also find it challenging. Now, I do want to point out a reality about this that I think makes this a little easier for them, but it's also a reality that's going to be challenged chapter after chapter, especially in the first half of this book. You see, this is a monocultural group right now, largely. People share the same religious backgrounds. They have some shared values with one another, shared expectations with one another. They're majority Palestinian-raised Jewish people who speak Aramaic. One of the things that we see in many of our churches is that when we become increasingly multicultural, disharmony can arise. Well, why? Because so much of that harmony is predicated on monoculturalism. We want a shared value system, but it should be my value system, right? We want a shared culture, but really it should be my culture. And this is where so much of the conflict comes in the book of Acts. It's part of why I love this book. Because in order to be harmonious with one another, in order for them to be living out harmony and love as God is leading them, they have to go against the grain of what feels safe for the people who holds the majority power in their religious system. They have to learn how to reconcile with people who have been national enemies of theirs, folks who have done harm to them, people who speak different languages, people who may have greater needs than the majority power holders. They have to learn how to be people of harmony and love when they're sharing space with those who have different gender and sexual identities. Yes, that does show up in this book. They have to learn how to be people of harmony and love, even when faced with murderous enemies who seek to put down their swords and be in community with them. This idea demands sometimes deep sacrifice for them. And it could be a heartbreaking tension. Everything is a potential crisis that could end this institution because it's so small and it's so new. And yet, instead of navigating towards the path of safety, where it's just me and mine, they choose to live ever outward because in their view, God is for all, not just for some. I find myself so challenged by this today because here we are 2,000 years later, and this is still breeding such disharmony. And so much of it in our society-wide lens is fomented in America by churches. But that's never been the point. That's not supposed to be the point. The point has always been for us to live out harmony and love with one another, with our neighbors, with God. And if we're not doing those things, we might as well just be a business. Why else are we here? Church, I've said this often, but I really do mean it each and every time. This is one of those things that I think we're trying to do in Park Rose Community United Church of Christ. This is a reality we're trying to live into. And with the help of God, I think we are having beautiful tastes of God's will on earth as it is in heaven. But just like the early church, we'll always have the temptation to draw back to safety, to think smaller instead of bigger, to think more protective instead of being willing to risk ourselves for the good of one another and our neighbors. I hope over the next few weeks and months, we can find some solace and inspiration in this book. Because what we're doing is not new. It's just not as common as it should be.